Chris Chibnall's final episode as showrunner and the final episode with Jodie Whittaker as the Doctor has finally aired, and I shouldn't have enjoyed it as much as I did. Now, if you know me, you know I haven't been the biggest fan of the Chibnall era as a whole, and to be honest, I wasn't that excited for the power of the Doctor, and the part of me that was mostly just excited for the era to finally come to a close, and to see the regeneration. But I actually enjoyed this episode a lot more than I expected. This episode opens with a fun space train set piece, where the Doctor, Yaz, and Dan are rescuing passengers from a cyber attack, which I actually predicted was going to be the opening scene. This scene was fine and quite a fun way to open the episode, but it ends with Dan deciding to leave the TARDIS after a near-death experience, which I also predicted would happen. Now this seems very sudden, but I'm honestly fine with it because Dan hasn't been a part of the TARDIS team for very long at this point, and it just shows Chibnall knows what he needs to focus on in this episode. But it also makes sense. Dan did nearly die, so as sudden of an exit as this feels, he's got a valid excuse to leave. Now obviously the Master is the main villain in this episode, and I personally love Sacha Dhawan's performance in this episode. In the past I've been a bit unsure on his performance, as for the most part I really enjoy it, but I do find him to be a little bit over the top sometimes. But his performance in this episode was really good, and I especially liked the scenes between him and Yaz when he's taken over the Doctor's body.
You think I am gonna let you? I am the Doctor now! I am the Doctor!
But his plan in this episode doesn't make that much sense. For starters, the Daleks, and even the Cybermen to a certain extent, weren't really needed in this episode. The earthquake plot with the Daleks don't really seem that relevant to the story to me. The Cybermen, however, do feel a lot more relevant, as the cyber attack on Unit gives something for Ace, Tegan, and Kate to do, and it's nice that these characters get something more to do than Kate and Captain Jack did in previous episodes of this era. Now, Ashad returns in this episode as basically a leader to the Cybermen, and I feel like they clearly just brought him back because people really liked him in the previous episode, but he's definitely not as good in this episode. He doesn't really do a whole lot besides just leading the Cybermen, and I feel like the explanation for his return just was not needed at all, as in the same scene it was already established that tissue compression can be reversed, so I don't know why they included the line that the Master cloned him. It just feels really lazy to me.
I am so glad I cloned you.
Now, I also want to quickly mention that Vinder also makes a return in this episode, which was nice to see because I do personally quite like the character and Jacob Anderson's performance, but I just don't think he was really needed in this episode personally, as the only purpose he served was to shoot the Master to get him to degenerate back into 13, which I think personally could have been done by Yaz, as earlier on in the episode they gave her a gun which seemed like it was going to be set up for something.
Give her a gun.
But never got paid off in the episode besides her just pointing it at the Master whilst they were in the TARDIS. Now, as I said, the Master's plan doesn't really make sense, and I don't know why half of the plot needed to happen in 1916. To me, it just seems really obvious that Chibnall wanted the Master to dance to Ra Ra Rasputin and just work back from there. But I'm genuinely not too annoyed at that decision because I did personally love that moment in the episode. Now, the forced regeneration also doesn't really make that much sense and wasn't really needed, as the Master could have easily just dressed up as the Doctor and paraded around as her to give her a negative reputation, because he still looks like the Master anyway when he's in the Doctor's body. Now, the only excuse I've heard for this is that he needed to get the Doctor out of the way, which does make sense, but I think it'd be a lot better if he still looked like the 13th Doctor, and this would have allowed Jodie to act as if the Master had taken over her body. Personally, the only thing that would have really made this work for me is if this forced regeneration somehow caused 13's regeneration, instead of her just being shot by a laser at the end of the episode. Now, of course, we also get some cameos from classic Doctors in this episode, in a scene where the 13th Doctor is in some sort of regeneration limbo, which I think was a very clever way of bringing back classic Doctors and explaining why they look older than they should. It did feel a little strange to me having David Bradley there, as all the other Doctors were played by their actual actors, but I do suppose it had to be the first Doctor that she saw first, and I was very happy to see Paul McGann as the 8th Doctor in this, as he is personally my favourite Doctor, and I think he deserves more screen time, and I'm glad they came up with some excuse as to why he got to wear his Night of the Doctor costume.
I don't do robes.
Because that is also my favourite Doctor costume of all time. We also got some scenes between both Tegan and the 5th Doctor's hologram, and Ace and the 7th Doctor as a hologram. Now, these moments were some of the few moments I actually teared up in the episode, which is weird for me because I haven't actually seen any of the stories these characters have previously appeared in. But these scenes are also a clever way of having the classic Doctors reappear while still looking older. Now, this hologram also allowed for the Fugitive Doctor to make a cameo in this episode, and it is really unfortunate that this was was just a cameo, and that Chibnall decided to not wrap up the Timeless Child arc. Now this does make sense, as a lot of people didn't like that arc, myself included, but it still would have been nice to have some sort of closure to that arc, as it now seems a little bit pointless, and RTD probably isn't going to dive into that in the future. But with that being said, the episode does kind of work better without it, as there wouldn't be enough time or focus in this episode for them to wrap that up. This could also be said for the episode as a whole, as Chibnall could have chosen to wrap up all the loose threads in this story, such as the Timeless Child, the Fugitive Doctor, and Thasmin, which is really unfortunate as that has only been set up in the past 2 episodes and doesn't really get a mention here. But instead he chose to give us a good send-off for the 13th Doctor and a great celebration of Doctor Who's past. Although with that being said, this episode still consists of a plot that is hanging on by a thread and is still full of some not so great Chibnall dialogue.
Seismology, volcanoes, Daleks, and the Master. No, this is not good news.
But overall, I had a really great time with this episode, which maybe was helped with me knowing that it was the end of an era. But nevertheless, I still really enjoyed it. Now obviously, this is also a regeneration story, so it does end with the Doctor regenerating. Now, although Yaz's exit in this episode does feel quite rushed and doesn't make a whole lot of sense, I still personally love the scene, mostly due to Jodie and Mandip's performance. The moment where Yaz sees the Doctor is about to regenerate and just starts crying because she knows what it means was maybe my favourite scene in this whole episode, and genuinely made me cry, as did their final moments together on top of the TARDIS looking at Earth. Now, as for the regeneration itself, I personally loved Jodie's final words, and I preferred this scene being as simple as it was, with no speech, as I feel like this suits this Doctor more. Now, I personally think the regeneration looked great, and I think this was really helped with it being set outside in a wide open space. And I think having the regeneration intercut with the companion support group, where we see a few classic companions return, made it feel really special. Now obviously this episode ends with the Doctor regenerating into David Tennant, which I predicted, along with him saying, What? As well as a short trailer for the 60th anniversary, which if you want to know more about those specials, you can watch this video here.